They say blood is thicker than water. But what happens when your own child looks at you like you're nothing more than a financial burden? What happens when the person you sacrificed everything for tells you that keeping you alive costs too much? My name is Janice Murphy, but everyone calls me Jan. I'm 73 years old, and 3 weeks ago, I learned that sometimes the people who are supposed to love you the most can break your heart in ways you never imagined possible. But I also learned something else, something that would change everything between my son and me forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. You see, when David told me my medical bills were bankrupting the family, and that maybe it was time to consider my options, he had no idea who he was really talking to. He had no idea that the woman he was ready to abandon had been quietly shaping the very place that would determine my fate. This is the story of how one conversation revealed the true character of my son and led to a revelation that would shake our family to its core. It's about the choices we make when we think nobody's watching, and the secrets that can either destroy us or set us free. The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office seemed harsher than usual that Tuesday morning. I sat in the chair across from her desk, my hands folded in my lap, trying to maintain the composure I'd perfected over 7 decades of life. The manila folder in front of her contained results that would either ease my growing concerns or confirm my worst fears. Dr. Martinez had been my physician for nearly 15 years. She'd seen me through Harold's final battle with cancer, watched me navigate the grief that followed, and helped me adjust to life as a widow. Her expression that morning told me everything I needed to know before she even opened her mouth. "Jan, I'm not going to sugarcoat this," she began, her voice gentle, but direct. "The biopsy results show that you have stage 3 ovarian cancer. It's aggressive, but it's not a death sentence. We caught it early enough that with the right treatment plan, your prognosis can be very positive." The words seemed to echo in the small room. Cancer. The same disease that had taken Harold just 4 years earlier. I felt a familiar chill run down my spine, but I kept my expression steady. I'd learned long ago that falling apart in public solved nothing. "What does treatment look like?" I asked, my voice remarkably calm considering the storm brewing in my chest. Dr. Martinez pulled out several sheets of paper, each one detailing different aspects of what lay ahead. Surgery to remove the tumor and affected tissue, chemotherapy to eliminate any remaining cancer cells, regular monitoring and follow-up treatments. The timeline stretched out for months, possibly longer depending on how my body responded. I won't lie to you, Jan. This isn't going to be easy. The treatment itself can be quite demanding, especially for someone your age. But you're strong, and your overall health has been excellent. I believe you can handle this. I listened as she explained the specifics, the medical terminology washing over me like a foreign language I was desperately trying to understand. When she finished, I had only one question that seemed to matter in that moment. How much time do I have to decide? We should start as soon as possible. I'd like to schedule your surgery for next week if we can arrange it. Time is important, with this type of cancer. I nodded, gathered the papers she handed me, and left her office with my head held high. It wasn't until I reached my car in the parking lot that I allowed myself a moment of vulnerability. Sitting behind the wheel, I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror. The woman staring back at me had raised 2 children, buried a husband, and survived more challenges than most people face in a lifetime. This would be another chapter in a story that refused to end quietly. The drive home gave me time to think about how to break the news to my family. David lived about 20 minutes away with his wife Sandra and their 2 teenagers. My daughter, Lisa, had moved to Seattle 5 years ago for her husband's job, and while we spoke regularly, the distance made everything more complicated. I decided to call David first. That evening, I made the call from my kitchen, the same room where I'd received countless phone calls over the years. Good news, bad news, and everything in between. David answered on the 3rd ring, his voice distracted. Hi, Mom. What's up? I'm just helping Tyler with his homework. I need to talk to you about something important. Could you come over this evening, or would tomorrow be better? Something in my tone must have caught his attention because his voice became more focused. Is everything okay? I'd rather discuss it in person. It's not an emergency, but it is serious. I can come over after we finish up here. Give me about an hour. While I waited for David, I found myself walking through the house, Harold, and I had shared for 42 years. Every room held memories. Every photograph told a story. The living room where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. The kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals. The bedroom where we'd whispered dreams and fears in the darkness. Harold had been the financial mind in our partnership. While I managed the household and raised the children, he built a successful consulting business that grew beyond our wildest expectations. He was brilliant with investments, always thinking 3 steps ahead. Even after his death, the financial advisors he'd chosen continued to manage our portfolio with the same careful attention he would have demanded. I'd never been one to flaunt wealth or live ostentatiously. We drove reliable cars, lived in the same modest home for decades, and found joy in simple pleasures. Harold often joked that people would never guess how well we'd done financially by looking at our lifestyle. The best kind of wealth, he used to say, is the kind that gives you options without changing who you are. David arrived just as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the front yard. He looked tired, probably from his long days at the insurance company where he worked as a claims adjuster. At 45, he was entering what should have been the prime of his career, but I could see the stress of modern life weighing on him. "Sorry I'm a little late," he said, kissing my cheek as he came through the door. Traffic was brutal. I led him to the living room, the same room where I'd told him about his father's diagnosis years earlier. We sat across from each other, and I could see him bracing himself for whatever news I was about to share. "I saw Dr. Martinez today," I began. "I've been having some symptoms that concerned me, so she ran some tests." David leaned forward slightly, his expression growing serious. "What kind of symptoms?" "Abdominal pain, some fatigue, nothing dramatic. But given my age, she wanted to be thorough." I took a breath, steadying myself for his reaction. "The tests showed that I have ovarian cancer. Stage 3. The color drained from David's face. He sat back in his chair as if the news had physically pushed him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. "Cancer," he repeated, the word hanging between us. How bad is it?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Martinez says it's treatable. The survival rates for this stage are encouraging, especially with aggressive treatment. I'll need surgery next week, followed by chemotherapy. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from his childhood when he was overwhelmed. "This is happening so fast. Are you sure about the diagnosis? Maybe you should get a second opinion." "I trust Dr. Martinez completely. She's been my doctor for years, and she's consulted with oncology specialists. I'm confident in her assessment." "What about Lisa? Does she know yet?" "I wanted to tell you first, then call her this evening. I know it's a lot to process." David stood up and began pacing, another childhood habit that surfaced during times of stress. I watched him struggle with the news, understanding that he needed time to absorb what this meant for our family. "What's the treatment going to cost?" he asked suddenly, stopping mid-pace to look at me. The question caught me off guard, not because it wasn't practical, but because it was his first concern after learning about my diagnosis. "I haven't gotten detailed cost estimates yet. Dr. Martinez said her office would work with insurance to determine coverage." "Mom, you know insurance doesn't cover everything, and this kind of treatment, cancer treatment, is expensive. Really expensive." I studied my son's face, looking for the compassion I expected to see, the concern for my well-being that should have been his primary focus. Instead, I saw worry lines that seemed more about finances than my health. "We'll figure it out, David. That's not what's important right now." "But it is important," he insisted. "I mean, of course your health is the most important thing. But we have to be realistic. Sandra and I are already stretched thin with the kids' expenses, college savings, the mortgage. If this treatment is going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars." He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air between us. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a disappointment so profound that it took my breath away. "Are you suggesting I shouldn't pursue treatment because of the cost?" "No, that's not what I'm saying." But his hesitation before answering told me everything I needed to know. "I'm just saying we need to understand what we're dealing with financially. Maybe there are less expensive options. Maybe we need to shop around, get quotes from different hospitals." I stood up slowly, my legs feeling suddenly unsteady. This was my son, the child I'd rocked to sleep, taught to ride a bike, cheered for at every soccer game and school play. This was the young man I'd helped through college, supported through his early career struggles, and celebrated with at his wedding. "David, I'm not buying a car. I'm fighting for my life." "I know that, Mom, but life is expensive, and death is expensive too. We need to be practical about this." The callousness of that statement hit me like a physical blow. I walked to the window, looking out at the garden Harold and I had planted together, trying to process what I was hearing from my own child. "Your father left me very comfortable financially," I said without turning around. "I'm not going to be a burden on you or Sandra. But comfortable doesn't mean unlimited funds. And if this treatment goes on for months, if there are complications, if you need ongoing care, Mom, I'm just trying to be responsible here." I turned back to face him, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in years. When had my son become someone who calculated the cost of keeping his mother alive? When had practicality become more important than love? "I think you should go," I said quietly. "Mom, don't be like that. I'm trying to help." "By suggesting I might be too expensive to keep alive?" "That's not fair. I never said that." "You didn't have to say it directly, David. The message was clear enough." He gathered his jacket, his expression a mixture of frustration and guilt. "I'll call you tomorrow when we've both had time to think about this more clearly." After he left, I sat in my living room as darkness settled around me. The house felt larger and emptier than it had since Harold's death. I thought about calling Lisa, but the conversation with David had drained me of the energy needed for another emotional discussion. Instead, I found myself thinking about choices. The choice to fight this disease or to give up. The choice to forgive my son's reaction or to let it poison what remained of our relationship. The choice to reveal truths that had been carefully guarded for years or to let him continue believing things that weren't accurate. Harold used to say that character isn't revealed in good times but in moments of crisis. Anyone can be generous when it costs them nothing, he'd tell me. But who you really are shows up when the stakes are high. I'd learned something about David's character that evening, something that broke my heart in ways I wasn't sure could be healed. But he'd also revealed his ignorance about situations that would soon become very relevant to both our lives. As I prepared for bed that night, I caught sight of myself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at me had the same gray hair I'd been coloring for 15 years, the same brown eyes that had watched my children grow up, the same hands that had comforted scraped knees and wiped away tears. But there was something different now, something harder in my expression. I was facing cancer, but I was also facing the painful reality that my son saw me as a financial liability rather than his mother. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly understand, was that his concern about medical bills was based on assumptions that were completely wrong. The next morning brought calls to make and appointments to schedule. Dr. Martinez's office contacted me about pre-surgical procedures and scheduling. The hospital's financial counselor wanted to discuss payment options and insurance coverage. Each conversation reminded me of David's callous calculations the evening before. But as I navigated these discussions, I found myself thinking about other conversations I'd had over the years, meetings with hospital administrators, discussions with my financial advisor about charitable giving, decisions about philanthropic, priorities that Harold and I had made together, and choices I'd continued making after his death. David had no idea about any of these conversations. He knew his father had done well financially, but he'd never been privy to the full scope of our success, or how we'd chosen to use that success. He'd grown up in a comfortable middle-class home with parents who worked hard and lived modestly. What he didn't know was that his parents had also given generously and quietly to causes they believed in. The phone rang around 10 that morning. It was David, his voice more subdued than it had been the night before. "Mom, I want to apologize for how I handled things yesterday. I was in shock about your diagnosis, and I didn't express myself well. I appreciate that, David. I've been thinking about it all night, and Sandra and I want to help however we can. We'll figure out the financial side of things." His tone was conciliatory, but I could hear the underlying anxiety. He was still worried about money, still calculating costs and considering options that shouldn't be part of this equation. "That's very kind of you," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "Have you had a chance to call the hospital about costs? Do we know what kind of numbers we're looking at?" There it was again. The focus on money rather than on my well-being. I realized that David's apology hadn't changed his fundamental perspective. He was sorry for how he'd expressed his concerns, but the concerns themselves remained the same. "I have a meeting with the financial counselor this afternoon," I told him. "Good, that's good. Maybe I should come with you. These hospital people can be pretty aggressive about collecting money, and you might need someone to advocate for you." The irony of his offer wasn't lost on me. He wanted to protect me from hospital financial staff while simultaneously questioning whether my treatment was worth the cost. I declined his offer, telling him I preferred to handle it myself. That afternoon, I drove to St. Mary's Medical Center for my appointment with Margaret Chen, the financial counselor. I'd been to this hospital many times over the years, visiting friends, attending community events, meeting with various staff members for reasons David would never suspect. St. Mary's was a beautiful facility, expanded and modernized over the past decade with state-of-the-art equipment and amenities that rivaled any hospital in the region. The cancer center was particularly impressive, designed to provide both cutting-edge treatment and a healing environment for patients and families. Margaret Chen was a kind woman in her 50s who clearly took her job seriously. She welcomed me into her office with genuine warmth and began reviewing my insurance coverage and the anticipated costs of my treatment. "Mrs. Murphy, I've reviewed your case with Dr. Martinez and our oncology team. The treatment plan is comprehensive but very appropriate for your diagnosis. Your insurance will cover a significant portion of the costs, and for any remaining balance, we have several payment plan options available." She handed me a detailed breakdown of estimated costs. Surgery, chemotherapy, hospital stays, follow-up care. The numbers were substantial, exactly the kind of figures that would send someone like David into financial panic. "I understand this can seem overwhelming," Margaret continued, "but I want you to focus on your treatment and recovery. We'll work with you on the financial aspects." I looked at the papers she'd given me, then set them aside. "Mrs. Chen, I think there might be some confusion about my account." She looked puzzled. "I'm sorry? Could you check my file again? I believe there may be special considerations that apply to my case." Margaret turned to her computer, typing my name and date of birth. I watched her expression change as she accessed information that clearly surprised her. Oh my, she said softly, then looked up at me with a mixture of recognition and embarrassment. Mrs. Murphy, I apologize. I didn't realize. Your account has special donor status. Your treatment costs will be fully covered through the hospital's benefactor program. I nodded calmly. I thought that might be the case. Mrs. Murphy, I had no idea you were. I mean, everyone here knows about your contributions to the hospital, but I didn't connect your name when I was preparing for our meeting. I prefer to keep my charitable activities private, I told her. Of course, absolutely. And please know how grateful we all are for everything you've done for St. Mary's, the cancer center renovation, the new equipment, the patient assistance fund. Your generosity has touched so many lives. Margaret gathered up the cost estimates she'd prepared, clearly flustered by her oversight. Obviously, these projections don't apply to your situation. Your treatment will be provided at no cost, and you'll have access to any additional services or amenities you might need. I thanked her and left the hospital with a very different understanding of my situation than the one I'd entered with. The medical bills that had David so concerned were essentially non-existent. My treatment would cost me nothing out of pocket, not because of insurance coverage, but because of choices Harold and I had made years ago about how to use our wealth. Driving home, I thought about the conversation I'd have with David that evening. He'd want to know about the costs, and I could tell him the truth, that money wouldn't be a problem. But I wasn't sure I was ready to explain why. Harold and I had always believed that true generosity should be anonymous. We'd given millions to various causes over the years without seeking recognition or acknowledgement. Our names weren't on plaques or buildings. Our donations weren't announced in newsletters or annual reports. We gave because we believed it was the right thing to do, not because we wanted credit for it. But our anonymous giving had created a situation where our own children had no idea about the extent of our philanthropy. David's concern about medical bills was based on his assumption that his parents had been comfortable, but not wealthy. He had no idea that the hospital treating his mother had been renovated and equipped largely through donations from his parents. That evening, David called again, his voice anxious. How did the meeting go with the financial counselor? It went very well. The costs won't be a problem. Really, that's great news. Did insurance cover more than they initially thought? I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. The hospital has programs to help patients in situations like mine. I won't have any out-of-pocket expenses. Wow, that's incredible. What kind of programs? Charitable programs for patients who meet certain criteria. It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't the complete truth either. David seemed satisfied with my explanation, his relief evident in his voice. That's such a weight off my mind, Mom. I was really worried about how we were going to handle those costs. His relief should have made me happy, but instead, it reinforced my disappointment in his initial reaction. He was pleased that the financial burden had been lifted, but his pleasure seemed more about protecting his own resources than ensuring my care. Over the next few days, as I prepared for surgery, I found myself reflecting on the choices that had led to this moment. Harold and I had always taught our children the value of hard work, responsibility, and giving back to the community. But somewhere along the way, David had internalized a different message about money and priorities. I wondered if we'd been too successful in hiding our wealth from our children. Had our modest lifestyle and careful spending given them the impression that resources were always limited? Had we failed to teach them that generosity should extend to family as well as strangers? The morning of my surgery arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that Harold had always loved. David and Sandra came to the hospital to see me off, their faces showing the appropriate concern and support. Lisa flew in from Seattle, taking time off from her job to be with me during the procedure. As they wheeled me into the operating room, I looked at the faces of my children and wondered what the coming months would reveal about all of us. Cancer would test my physical strength. But the real test might be whether my family could navigate the challenges ahead with love and integrity intact. The last thing I remembered before the anesthesia took effect was a conversation Harold and I had had years earlier about legacy. "Money is just a tool," he'd said. "What matters is how you use it and what it reveals about who you really are." I was about to discover what my illness would reveal about the people I loved most, and what secrets would need to be shared to preserve the relationships that mattered most to me. The cancer might take my hair, my strength, and my energy, but it wouldn't take my dignity or my power to make choices that reflected my values. David thought he understood our family's financial situation, but he was about to learn that his assumptions were based on incomplete information. The question wasn't whether we could afford my treatment. The question was whether our family could afford the cost of his coldness and my silence about truths that had remained hidden too long. As consciousness faded, I made a decision that would change everything between my son and me. The time for secrets was coming to an end, and the time for revelations was about to begin. Recovery from surgery wasn't as straightforward as I'd hoped. 3 days in the hospital stretched into 5, then 6, as my body struggled to heal properly. Dr. Martinez assured me this was normal for someone my age, but each additional day brought new visits from David, and with them, increasingly uncomfortable conversations about my future. He arrived on Thursday morning carrying a stack of papers and wearing the expression he'd perfected during his years as an insurance claims investigator. It was the look of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news while maintaining professional detachment. "Mom, I've been doing some research," he announced, settling into the visitor's chair beside my bed. "I think we need to talk about what happens after you leave here." I was still groggy from pain medication, but something in his tone cut through the fog immediately. "What kind of research?" "Well, the chemotherapy is going to be rough. Really rough. And at your age, living alone in that big house." He shuffled through his papers. "I've been looking into some options that might make more sense." The word options had taken on an ominous quality in our recent conversations. I adjusted my position in the hospital bed, ignoring the sharp protest from my surgical incisions. "What kind of options, David?" "Assisted living facilities, not nursing homes," he added quickly, as if that distinction would soften the blow. "Nice places where you'd have your own apartment, but with medical support available around the clock." I stared at him, trying to process what I was hearing through the haze of medications and exhaustion. "You want to put me in assisted living?" "I want you to be safe, Mom, and realistic about what you're facing. Months of chemotherapy, potential complications, recovery time that could stretch on indefinitely. Sandra and I both work full-time. The kids have their activities and college applications coming up. We can't provide the kind of care you're going to need." "I haven't asked you to provide care. But you're going to need it. And home health care is expensive. Really expensive. I ran some numbers, and between the cost of professional caregivers and maintaining that house, you're looking at thousands of dollars every month for an indefinite period." There it was again, the cold calculation that had replaced any warmth or compassion in my son's voice. I watched him flip through printed pages of facility information, comparing costs and amenities, as if he were shopping for insurance policies rather than planning his mother's life. "These places aren't bad, Mom. Look at this one." He held up a brochure showing smiling elderly residents in a tastefully decorated common room. "They have activities, meal plans, medication management, and it's significantly less expensive than trying to maintain independent living with the level of care you're going to need." "How much less expensive?" "About half the cost of home care, and that's not even factoring in the savings from selling the house." "Selling the house?" The words came out sharper than I intended, causing David to look up from his papers with mild surprise. "Mom, you can't maintain a 4-bedroom house while you're going through cancer treatment. The yard work alone is more than you should be handling. And the equity from the sale would help offset your medical expenses and give you a nice cushion for whatever comes next. Whatever comes next. The phrase hung in the air between us like a dark cloud. I realized that my son had already written the ending to my story, and it didn't include recovery or return to my normal life. David, I'm not dying. Dr. Martinez said the prognosis is very good with treatment. Of course it is, he replied, but his tone suggested he didn't entirely believe it. But even if everything goes perfectly, you're going to be dealing with this for months, maybe years. And let's be honest about your age. You're 73. Even without cancer, how much longer were you planning to live independently in that house? The casual cruelty of the question took my breath away. I looked at this man who had once been my little boy, searching for any trace of the child who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, who cried when he accidentally stepped on a caterpillar, who hugged me so tightly when he left for college that I thought my ribs might crack. I hadn't set an expiration date on my independence, I said quietly. I'm not trying to be harsh, Mom. I'm trying to be practical. We need to make decisions based on reality, not on what we wish were true. A nurse entered the room to check my vital signs, providing a temporary interruption to our conversation. I watched David organize his papers while she worked, noting how he'd prepared for this discussion like a business presentation. He'd researched facilities, calculated costs, and developed a comprehensive plan for dismantling my life, all without consulting me about what I wanted or needed. After the nurse left, David resumed his pitch. I've actually scheduled tours of 3 different places for next week. 2 of them have immediate availability, and the third has a waiting list, but could probably accommodate you within a month. You scheduled tours without asking me? I wanted to have options ready. Time is important here, Mom. The best facilities fill up quickly, and if we wait too long, you might end up somewhere that's not as nice. I closed my eyes, trying to center myself before responding. The pain medication made it difficult to think clearly, but I knew I needed to address this conversation before it went any further. David, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to make decisions about assisted living or selling my house. I just had surgery 3 days ago. But that's exactly why we need to plan ahead. You can't go home to an empty house and expect to manage chemotherapy treatments by yourself. What if you fall? What if you have a reaction to the medications? What if you need emergency help in the middle of the night? His questions were valid, which made his approach even more frustrating. There were legitimate concerns about my safety and care during treatment, but his solutions all seemed designed to minimize inconvenience for him rather than maximize support for me. There are other options besides assisted living, I pointed out. Like what? Home healthcare workers cost a fortune, and they're not available 24 hours a day. Live-in care is even more expensive, and none of those options address the problem of maintaining that house while you're sick. I studied my son's face, looking for any sign that his primary concern was my well-being, rather than the cost of my care. What I saw instead was a man who had convinced himself that his financial calculations were acts of love. What if money weren't an issue? I asked. The question seemed to confuse him. But money is an issue. It's a huge issue. Mom, I know Dad left you comfortable, but comfortable and wealthy are 2 different things. Cancer treatment can bankrupt families, even families with good insurance. And if this goes on for years, what if I told you that money really isn't a concern? David set down his papers and looked at me with the patient expression he might use with a confused elderly person who didn't understand her own financial situation. Mom, I know you don't like to worry about money, but somebody has to be realistic here. Your savings might seem substantial to you, but medical expenses can eat through retirement funds incredibly quickly. How much do you think your father left me? The directness of my question seemed to catch him off guard. We'd never discussed specific numbers, operating instead on his assumptions about our middle-class lifestyle and modest spending habits. "I don't know exactly," he admitted, "but based on Dad's salary and your lifestyle, probably a few $100,000, maybe more with the house equity." I nodded slowly, understanding now how completely wrong his assumptions were. David had no idea that his parents had been quietly wealthy for decades, or that his father's comfortable insurance business had generated millions in profit over the years. He'd grown up in a house where money was never flaunted or discussed in specific terms, leading him to believe we lived paycheck to paycheck like most middle-class families. "David, what would you say if I told you that your father left me considerably more than a few $100,000? "How much more?" I hesitated, not because I was unsure of the numbers, but because I was unsure of how revealing them would change our relationship. Harold and I had always believed that children should earn their own way in the world, that inherited wealth could be more curse than blessing if not handled carefully. We'd supported David and Lisa through college and helped with down payments on their first homes, but we'd never discussed the full extent of our assets. Enough that the cost of my medical care isn't a factor in making decisions about my treatment or living situation. David leaned forward, his expression shifting from condescension to confusion. "Mom, what are you saying exactly?" "I'm saying that your concerns about bankrupting the family are based on incorrect assumptions about our financial situation. But if you have more money than I thought, why didn't you ever say anything? Why let me worry about these costs?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications that neither of us was quite ready to address. Why hadn't I corrected his assumptions earlier? Why had I allowed him to agonize over expenses that were essentially meaningless to our family's financial picture? The truth was complex and painful. I'd wanted to see how my son would respond to my illness when he believed resources were limited. I'd wanted to know whether his love for me was conditional on my not being a financial burden. The answers to those questions had broken my heart in ways I was still trying to understand. "I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become," I said finally. The words hit him like a physical blow. He sat back in his chair, his face cycling through confusion, hurt, and dawning realization. "You tested me?" "Not intentionally. But when you immediately started calculating costs instead of asking how you could help me get better, I realized I didn't know my own son as well as I thought I did." David stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the hospital's courtyard. I could see his reflection in the glass, his expression a mixture of anger and shame. "That's not fair, Mom. Of course I want you to get better, but someone has to think about practical matters. Someone has to plan for the expenses and logistics. That doesn't mean I don't love you. Doesn't it?" The question came out more bluntly than I'd intended, but the pain medication had lowered my usual filters. "Because from where I'm lying, it sounds like you've been more concerned about protecting your inheritance than ensuring my recovery." He spun around to face me, his eyes flashing with anger. "My inheritance? Is that what you think this is about? Isn't it? You've spent more time calculating the cost of keeping me alive than you have asking how I'm feeling or what I need to get through this. I've been trying to help. By pressuring me to move into assisted living and sell my house before I've even started chemotherapy?" The confrontation was exhausting me, both physically and emotionally. I could feel my energy draining away, leaving me vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with surgery or cancer. David returned to his chair, his expression softening slightly. "Mom, I'm sorry if I've handled this wrong. I was scared. I am scared. When you told me about the cancer, all I could think about was losing you the way we lost Dad. And yes, I worried about the financial impact, because that's what responsible adults do. They plan for worst-case scenarios. Your worst-case scenario seemed to involve me dying quickly and cheaply. That's not true, and you know it. But was it true? Had my son's practical planning revealed an unconscious wish that my illness wouldn't drag on too long or cost too much? The thought was almost too painful to consider, but I couldn't shake the feeling that his relief about my charitable coverage had more to do with protecting his resources than ensuring my care. Doctor. Martinez entered the room, interrupting our tense conversation with her usual cheerful professionalism. How are we feeling today, Jan? Your incision is healing nicely and your blood work looks good. I think we can probably send you home tomorrow. That's wonderful news, David said, jumping on the distraction. We were just discussing Mom's care plan for when she gets home. Excellent. Jan, do you have support in place for the first few weeks? Someone to help with meals, transportation to follow-up appointments, that sort of thing? I looked at David, wondering what he would say. Would he volunteer to help, or would he immediately start discussing the cost and inconvenience of providing support? We're still working out the details, he said carefully. Mom has some options she's considering. Options? There was that. Word again, loaded with implications about assisted living and house sales that I wasn't ready to accept. I'll be fine, I told Dr. Martinez. I have good neighbors, and I'm perfectly capable of managing my own care. Mom, David started, but I cut him off with a look. I said I'll be fine. Dr. Martinez glanced between us, clearly sensing tension, but choosing not to probe deeper. Well, chemotherapy won't start for another 2 weeks, so you'll have time to recover from surgery and make whatever arrangements work best for you. The important thing is that you have support when you need it. After she left, David and I sat in uncomfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, he gathered up his papers and stood to leave. I'm going to cancel those facility tours, he said. Good. But Mom, we still need to talk about this. About the money situation, about care planning, about what you're going to need in the coming months. Yes, we do need to talk, but not today. He nodded and moved toward the door, then stopped and turned back. For what it's worth, I really am sorry if I made you feel like your life was just a financial calculation. That was never my intention. I know, I replied, though I wasn't entirely sure I believed it. After David left, I found myself alone, with thoughts that were darker and more complicated than I wanted to face. My son's apology had seemed genuine, but it didn't erase the memory of his initial reaction to my diagnosis. It didn't change the fact that his first instinct had been to calculate costs rather than offer comfort. The next morning brought discharge, papers, and the prospect of returning home to begin the next phase of my treatment. Sandra came to pick me up, chatting nervously about everything except the elephant in the room. She'd clearly heard about my conversation with David, but she was too polite to bring it up directly. The house is going to feel so good after being in here, she said as we drove through familiar neighborhoods. David's been stopping by to check on things, bringing in the mail and that sort of thing. That's thoughtful of him. He's really worried about you, Jan. I know he doesn't always express it well, but he loves you so much. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond without revealing more of my complicated feelings about recent events. Sandra meant well, but her attempt to smooth things over only highlighted how fractured my relationship with David had become. The house felt both welcoming and foreign when I walked through the front door. Everything was exactly as I'd left it a week earlier, but I was returning as a different person. Cancer had changed me, but so had the revelation of my son's true character under pressure. That evening, Lisa called from Seattle. She'd flown back after my surgery but had to return to work sooner than either of us would have liked. How are you feeling, Mom? Really feeling, not just what you tell everyone else. Lisa had always been more perceptive than her brother, more willing to address difficult emotions directly. Physically, I'm doing well. Dr. Martinez is pleased with my recovery. And emotionally? I hesitated, not sure how much to share about my disappointment with David. It's been complicated. David told me about your conversation in the hospital, about the money situation and the care planning. What did he tell you? That you have more resources than he realized, and that you felt he was being insensitive about your treatment decisions. Lisa's summary was diplomatically phrased, but I could hear the concern in her voice. What do you think about all this? Honestly, I think David panicked. He's been carrying this burden of feeling responsible for everyone's financial security ever since Dad died. When you got sick, his first instinct was to try to control costs because that's how he manages his anxiety about money. Her insight was more generous than I felt capable of at the moment, but it also contained uncomfortable truths about family dynamics I'd been trying to ignore. Lisa, when you heard about my diagnosis, what was your first reaction? Terror. Absolute terror that I was going to lose you the same way we lost Dad. Not concern about how much it would cost? No, Mom. The money never crossed my mind. I was too scared about losing you to think about anything else. The contrast between my children's reactions was stark and painful. Lisa's response had been purely emotional, focused on love and fear of loss. David's had been practical and financial, focused on costs and management strategies. Do you think I'm being too hard on your brother? Lisa was quiet for a long moment. I think you're both dealing with scary stuff in different ways. David's not wrong that cancer treatment is expensive and that someone needs to think about practical matters. But you're not wrong that his approach felt cold and calculating. He wants me to sell the house and move into assisted living. Yeah, he mentioned that. What do you think about it? I think it's premature to make those kinds of decisions before I've even started treatment. I agree. But Mom, can I ask you something? Of course. How much money are we actually talking about here? David said you told him Dad left you more than he thought, but he was pretty vague about specifics. I found myself facing the same decision I'd wrestled with during my conversation with David. How much should I reveal about our family's financial situation? How much would change if my children understood the full scope of their parents' success? Your father was very good with investments, I said carefully. Better than either of you realized. Good enough that medical bills aren't a concern? Good enough that medical bills are completely irrelevant to any decisions I make about my care. Lisa whistled softly. Wow, I had no idea. We never wanted money to define our family or change how you kids approached your own lives. I get that, but maybe keeping it completely secret created its own problems. If David had known, he might not have reacted the way he did. Her observation was perceptive and troubling. Had Harold and I been wrong to keep our wealth so private? Had our desire to raise unspoiled children created a situation where they couldn't accurately assess family resources during times of crisis? Maybe you're right, I admitted. Mom, there's something else David mentioned that I want to ask you about. What's that? He said you told him that you'd tested him, that you wanted to see what kind of man he'd become. The words sounded harsher when repeated back to me, more calculated than I'd intended. I didn't set out to test him, Lisa. But when his reaction was so focused on money, I realized I was learning something about his character that I hadn't known before. And what did you learn? That he sees me as a financial liability, rather than his mother. Do you really believe that? The question forced me to examine my feelings more carefully. Did I truly believe that David valued money more than my life? Or was I hurt and disappointed by his lack of warmth during a frightening time? I don't know, I said finally. I hope not. But his reaction was so cold, so calculating. It was like he'd already written me off and was just trying to minimize the cost of my dying. Mom, David is scared. Scared of losing you. Scared of not being able to provide for his own family. Scared of making the wrong decisions. Fear makes people do weird things. Fear made you fly across the country to be with me. Fear made him research assisted living facilities. Different people handle fear differently. That doesn't necessarily mean David loves you less. I wanted to believe Lisa's interpretation, wanted to give my son the benefit of the doubt. But I couldn't shake the memory of his voice when he talked about costs and options, the way he'd discussed my life as if it were a business problem to be solved rather than a person to be supported. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine of recovery and preparation for the next phase of treatment. David stopped by daily, but our interactions were strained and superficial. He asked about my physical comfort, brought groceries, and handled practical matters with careful efficiency. But there was a distance between us that hadn't existed before, a wariness that colored every conversation. I found myself wondering about the other aspects of my life that David didn't fully understand. He knew I'd been involved in community activities over the years, but he had no idea about the scope of my charitable giving or the relationships I'd built with various organizations around town. The truth was that Harold and I had been quietly generous for decades. We'd supported the hospital, the library, the local food bank, and numerous other causes that mattered to us. We'd established scholarship funds, funded building projects, and provided emergency assistance to families in crisis. Our giving had been anonymous and substantial, reflecting our belief that those with resources had an obligation to help those without. David's concern about my medical expenses was particularly ironic, given my relationship with St. Mary's Medical Center. The cancer wing, where I would receive chemotherapy, had been largely funded by donations Harold and I had made over the years. The equipment that would be used in my treatment had been purchased with money we'd provided. The patient assistance programs that Margaret Chen had mentioned were programs we'd helped establish and fund. My son was worried about the cost of treatment at a hospital that had been shaped and supported by his parents' generosity for decades. The irony would have been amusing if it weren't so painful. A week after my discharge, I received a call from Dr. Patricia Hendricks, the hospital's chief development officer. Patricia and I had worked together on numerous projects over the years, though always with the understanding that my family's privacy was paramount. "Jan, I heard about your diagnosis, and I wanted to check in personally. How are you feeling?" "I'm doing well, Patricia. Ready to start treatment and get this behind me." "I'm sure you are. Listen, I hope this isn't presumptuous, but I wanted you to know that everyone here considers you family. If there's anything special you need during your treatment, anything at all, please don't hesitate to ask." "That's very kind, but I expect to be treated like any other patient." "Of course. But Jan, your contributions to this hospital over the years have been extraordinary. The least we can do is make sure you're as comfortable as possible while you're in our care." After hanging up, I found myself thinking about the conversation I would eventually need to have with David. How would he react when he learned that his mother wasn't just a patient at St. Mary's, but one of its most significant benefactors? How would he feel knowing that his concerns about medical costs were entirely misplaced? The doorbell interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find David standing on my front step with a large bouquet of flowers and an expression that mixed determination with nervousness. "Can we talk?" he asked. I invited him in, and we settled in the living room where so many important family conversations had taken place over the years. He seemed different somehow, less confident and more vulnerable than he'd been during our recent interactions. "Mom, I've been doing a lot of thinking since our conversation at the hospital." "So have I. I owe you an apology, a real one, not just for how I expressed my concerns, but for the concerns themselves." I waited for him to continue, curious about what had prompted this change in perspective. "I talked to Lisa, and she helped me understand something important. She said that when she heard about your diagnosis, her only thought was about possibly losing you. And I realized that should have been my first thought too. Instead, I immediately started worrying about logistics and costs and practical matters. Those things matter too, David. But they shouldn't have been my priority. You matter more than any amount of money, and I'm ashamed that I didn't make that clear from the beginning." His words were what I'd been hoping to hear, but they came with a new understanding of what had driven his initial reaction. Why do you think money was your first concern? David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that took me back to his childhood struggles with difficult emotions. I think I've been carrying around this fear about financial security ever since Dad died. Watching him get sick, seeing how expensive his treatment was, dealing with all the insurance complications afterward. It left me with this anxiety about medical costs that I've never really addressed. Your father's treatment was expensive? Incredibly expensive. Even with insurance, there were huge gaps in coverage. I remember you struggling with bills for months after he died. I stared at my son, trying to understand what he was describing. Harold's treatment had been extensive and costly, but we'd never struggled financially because of it. I'd handled the insurance paperwork and medical bills quietly, the same way I handled most financial matters, but there had never been any real hardship involved. David, what made you think I was struggling with your father's medical bills? I saw the bills, Mom, stacks of them, and I heard you on the phone with insurance companies arguing about coverage and fighting claim denials. His memory was accurate but incomplete. I had indeed spent hours on the phone with insurance companies, not because we couldn't afford the bills, but because I believed in holding them accountable for honoring their commitments. The bills had been substantial, but they'd never posed a threat to our financial security. I fought with insurance companies because it was the right thing to do, I explained. Not because we couldn't afford to pay the bills ourselves. But you seemed so stressed about money during that time. I was stressed about losing your father, not about paying for his care. David's face showed a dawning understanding of how his perceptions had shaped his fears. So, when you got sick, I was projecting my anxiety about Dad's situation onto yours. It seems that way. And when you mentioned having more resources than I realized, you weren't just talking about a little more money. I looked at my son. This man who had spent his entire adult life believing his parents lived modestly on the edge of financial insecurity. It was time to begin sharing truths that had been carefully guarded for decades. David, your father and I were very fortunate, financially, much more fortunate than we ever let on. How much more fortunate? I took a deep breath, preparing to change my son's understanding of his family's history. Fortunate enough that money has never been a constraint on any decision we've made. Fortunate enough that your children's college educations are already fully funded. Fortunate enough that neither you nor Lisa will ever need to worry about financial security. The words hung in the air between us, transforming everything David thought he knew about our family's circumstances. I watched his expression shift, from confusion to amazement to something that looked almost like betrayal. You're saying we're wealthy? Actually wealthy? Yes. How wealthy? The specific numbers seemed less important than the principle, but I could see that David needed concrete information to process this revelation. Wealthy enough that the cost of my cancer treatment is completely irrelevant to our family's financial picture. David sat back in his chair, looking stunned. Why didn't you ever tell us? Because your father and I believed that inherited wealth should be earned, not assumed. We wanted you and Lisa to build your own lives and careers without relying on family money. But if we'd known, I never would have worried about your medical bills. I never would have suggested assisted living or selling the house. I know. That's exactly why I didn't correct your assumptions immediately. You wanted to see how I'd react when I thought resources were limited. I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become when you thought caring for me might cost you something. The pain in David's eyes was unmistakable. He understood now that he'd failed a test he hadn't known he was taking, revealed aspects of his character that disappointed both of us. And what did you learn about the kind of man I am? It was a fair question, and one I wasn't sure I was ready to answer completely. I learned that you're practical and responsible, maybe too much so. I learned that you're willing to make difficult decisions when you think they're necessary, but I also learned that you can be cold in ways that break my heart. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I know you are. But David, apologies don't erase what happened. They don't change the fact that when you thought I might be expensive to care for, your first instinct was to find ways to minimize that expense. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us processing the implications of revelations that changed everything about our family dynamics. Finally, David spoke. What happens now? Between us, I mean. I don't know, I admitted. I love you and I know you love me, but trust is harder to rebuild than either of us might want to admit. Is there anything I can do? Anything at all? I looked at my son, seeing both the man who had disappointed me and the boy I'd raised with such hope and pride. The answer to his question was complicated, involving forgiveness and time and changes in perspective that couldn't be rushed. You can support me through this treatment without calculating costs or suggesting alternatives that prioritize convenience over hair? Of course, absolutely. And David, there are other things about your parents' life that you don't understand yet. Things that might surprise you as much as learning about our financial situation. What kind of things? I wasn't ready to reveal everything, not yet. But the foundation had been laid for conversations that would eventually need to happen. Things that will help you understand why your assumptions about costs and care were so far off the mark. As David prepared to leave, he turned back with one more question. Mom, when you said that money has never been a constraint on family decisions, did you mean that literally? I meant it literally. Then why did you and Dad live so modestly? Why didn't we live in a bigger house, or take expensive vacations, or drive luxury cars? It was a perceptive question that got to the heart of how Harold and I had chosen to use our wealth. Because we believed that the best way to use money was to help others, not to impress them. Because we found more satisfaction in giving than in spending. And because we wanted to raise children who valued character over possessions. Did it work? The part about raising us to value character? I looked at my son, thinking about the events of the past week and the revelations that were still to come. Ask me again in a few months. After David left, I found myself alone with thoughts that were both hopeful and troubling. My son had apologized sincerely and seemed genuinely committed to doing better, but I couldn't forget the coldness in his voice when he'd discussed my life in terms of costs and options. The truth was that David's test was far from over. He'd learned that money wasn't actually an issue, but he hadn't yet learned the full extent of his parents' involvement in the very institutions that would determine the quality of my care. He didn't know about the charitable giving, the anonymous donations, or the relationships Harold and I had built over decades of quiet generosity. Most importantly, he didn't know that his concerns about the cost of my treatment were not just misguided, but absurdly ironic. The hospital where I would receive chemotherapy, the doctors who would treat me, the equipment that would be used in my care, all of it had been shaped and supported by donations from his parents. Soon, David would learn that his mother wasn't just another patient at St. Mary's Medical Center. Soon, he would discover that she was one of the most significant benefactors in the hospital's history. And soon, he would have to confront the full implications of his initial reaction to my illness. The question wasn't whether our relationship could survive these revelations. The question was whether David could forgive himself for the man he'd revealed himself to be when he thought love might come with a price tag too high to pay. The chemotherapy infusion center at St. Mary's Medical Center buzzed with quiet activity. On Tuesday morning as I arrived for my first treatment, I'd spent the weekend mentally preparing for this moment, reading everything Dr. Martinez had given me about what to expect, arranging my schedule around the treatment cycles that would dominate the next several months of my life. What I hadn't prepared for was the wave of recognition that swept through the nursing staff when I checked in at the reception desk. The young woman behind the counter did a double take when she saw my name, then quickly excused herself to speak with someone in the back office. Within minutes, the head nurse, Carol Peterson appeared with a warm smile and an unmistakable air of deference. "Mrs. Murphy, what an honor to have you here today. I want you to know that everyone on our team is committed to making your treatment experience as comfortable as possible." Her tone was professional but carried an undertone of recognition that made me slightly uncomfortable. I'd always insisted that my charitable relationship with the hospital remain completely separate from any personal medical care I might need. "I appreciate that, Carol, but I hope to be treated like any other patient." "Of course, absolutely. But if you need anything at all during your treatments, please don't hesitate to ask." She escorted me to a private treatment room rather than the open bay area where most patients receive their infusions. The room was beautifully appointed with comfortable seating, large windows overlooking the hospital's healing garden, and amenities that clearly weren't standard for all patients. "This is lovely," I said, settling into the reclining chair. "But I'm sure other patients could benefit from this room more than I can." "Mrs. Murphy, this room was specifically designed with donors like you in mind. Please, let us provide you with the comfort you've helped create for so many others." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. I was receiving special treatment in a facility that existed largely because of my family's generosity, while my own son had spent weeks agonizing over the cost of that treatment. The situation would have been almost amusing if it weren't so painful. As Carol prepared my IV and began the pre-medication process, I found myself thinking about the conversations I'd had with Harold years ago about our philanthropic goals. We'd always agreed that the best charitable giving was anonymous and focused on lasting impact rather than personal recognition. The cancer center where I now sat had been one of our most significant projects, funded through a series of donations that had allowed the hospital to expand and modernize their oncology services. "Mrs. Murphy, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but your contributions to this hospital have touched so many lives. Just last month, we were able to provide free treatment to 3 families who couldn't afford care otherwise, thanks to the Patient Assistance Fund you and your late husband established." I nodded politely, but her words reminded me of another layer to the irony of my situation. David's concerns about my medical expenses weren't just misguided because we could afford the treatment. They were misguided because the very programs designed to help patients who couldn't afford care had been funded by his parents. The first chemotherapy session lasted 4 hours, during which I had plenty of time to reflect on the complicated emotions surrounding my family's relationship with this hospital. Dr. Sarah Chen, the oncologist overseeing my treatment, stopped by twice to check on my progress. She was professional and caring, but like the nursing staff, her manner suggested she knew exactly who I was, beyond just another cancer patient. "Your treatment plan is quite aggressive," she explained during her second visit, "but given your overall health and the stage at which we caught the cancer, I'm very optimistic about your response. The protocols we're using represent the latest advances in ovarian cancer treatment, made possible in part by research grants that generous donors, like you, have supported. Even my medical care was being delivered through systems and advances that my own generosity had helped fund. The medications flowing through my IV, the research behind the treatment protocols, the equipment monitoring my vital signs, all of it connected back to choices Harold and I had made about how to use our wealth. David arrived just as my treatment was finishing, looking nervous and carrying a small bag of items he thought might make me more comfortable. His expression when he saw the private room and the obviously preferential treatment I was receiving was one of confusion mixed with dawning awareness. "Mom, this is really nice. I didn't realize the cancer center had rooms like this." "It's very comfortable," I agreed, watching him take in the amenities and the attention from staff. Carol returned to disconnect my IV and review post-treatment instructions. Her deference toward me was even more pronounced with David present, as if she wanted to ensure he understood that his mother was someone special at this hospital. "Mrs. Murphy, we'll see you Thursday for your next session. Please don't hesitate." to call if you experience any side effects or have any concerns whatsoever. We have your direct number on file, and someone will always be available to help you." After she left, David helped gather my things while clearly processing what he'd observed. "Mom, the way they're treating you, it's like you're some kind of VIP patient. The staff here is very professional and caring with all their patients. But this room, the way they talk to you, the special attention, this isn't standard treatment, is it?" I looked at my son, seeing him begin to question assumptions that went deeper than just our family's financial situation. "David, let's focus on getting home. I'm feeling a bit tired." The drive home was quiet, but I could sense David's mind. Working through questions he wasn't quite ready to ask directly. He helped me into the house and made sure I was settled comfortably before broaching the subject that was clearly bothering him. "Mom, there's something different about how they treat you at that hospital. Something beyond just good patient care." "What makes you think that?" "The private room, the way the nurses spoke to you, the personal attention from the oncologist. And that nurse mentioned something about donors and patient assistance funds. It felt like they know you personally." I settled into my favorite chair in the living room, the same chair where Harold and I had made so many important decisions over the years. David sat across from me, his expression expectant and slightly confused. "I've been involved with the hospital in various volunteer capacities over the years," I said carefully. "What kind of volunteer work? Committee service? Fundraising assistance? That sort of thing." It wasn't technically a lie, but it was such a dramatic understatement of my relationship with St. Mary's that it felt dishonest. David seemed to sense there was more to the story. "How long have you been involved with them?" "Since before you were born. Your father and I always believed in supporting community institutions that served important needs. And that's why they treat you like you're someone important." "I think they treat all long-term volunteers with respect and appreciation." David nodded, apparently satisfied with my explanation, but I could see that he was filing away details that didn't quite add up. The private room, the deferential treatment, the personal attention from senior staff, none of it aligned with the level of recognition typically given to standard volunteers. Over the next few weeks, as I continued my chemotherapy treatments, David's curiosity about my relationship with the hospital continued to grow. He insisted on driving me to most of my appointments, claiming he wanted to support me through the treatment process. But I suspected he was also trying to understand the dynamics he was observing. During my third treatment session, we encountered Dr. Patricia Hendricks in the hallway outside the infusion center. Patricia had been the hospital's chief development officer for 8 years, and we'd worked together closely on numerous projects. She approached us with genuine warmth and obvious familiarity. "Jan, how are you feeling? How's the treatment going?" "Very well, thank you." "Patricia, I'd like you to meet my son David." "David? This is Dr. Hendricks." Patricia shook David's hand with the kind of smile that suggested she'd heard about him. "It's wonderful to finally meet you, David. Your mother has spoken of you often, over the years." David looked confused. "Over the years?" "Your mother and I have worked together on various hospital projects. She's been one of our most valued advisors and supporters." "Advisor?" "Patricia is being too generous," I interjected quickly. "I've simply helped with some community outreach efforts." Patricia looked at me with surprise, clearly puzzled by my downplaying of our relationship. "Jan, you're far too modest. David, your mother has been instrumental in some of the most significant improvements this hospital has made in the past 2 decades. I could see David processing this information, trying to reconcile Patricia's description with his understanding of his mother's activities. "What kind of improvements?" "Well, the cancer center renovation for one, the new patient assistance programs, the medical equipment upgrades. Your mother's vision and guidance have shaped so much of what we've been able to accomplish." "Vision and guidance?" Patricia seemed to realize that she was revealing information I preferred to keep private. "I should let you get to your treatment, Jan. David, it was lovely meeting you. I hope we'll have a chance to talk more in the future." After she left, David was quiet for several minutes. We completed the check-in process and settled into my treatment room before he finally spoke. "Mom, Dr. Hendricks made it sound like you've been involved in major hospital projects, like you've had significant influence on hospital policies and improvements. I've participated in some planning committees over the years, but the way she talked about your vision and guidance, the cancer center renovation, patient assistance programs, it sounds like more than committee participation." I focused on the IV being inserted into my arm, using the medical procedure as an excuse to avoid immediate response. But David's questions were becoming more pointed, and I knew I couldn't deflect them indefinitely. "Your father and I have always believed in supporting institutions that serve the community well. How have you supported them?" The question hung between us, loaded with implications that extended far beyond simple volunteer work. I looked at my son, this man who had spent weeks worrying about the cost of my medical care while sitting in a facility that had been shaped by his parents' generosity. "In various ways, David. Through time, effort, and financial contributions." "How much financial contribution are we talking about?" "Enough to make a difference." "Mom, please. I'm trying to understand something here. The way people treat you at this hospital, the respect they show you, the special accommodations. It all suggests a relationship that goes way beyond normal volunteer work or modest donations." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of secrets that had been carefully maintained for decades. David deserved answers, but I wasn't sure he was prepared for the full truth about his parents' charitable activities. "Your father and I gave generously to causes we believed in." "How generously?" "Very generously." "Could you be more specific?" I opened my eyes and looked directly at my son. "David, are you asking because you're genuinely curious about your parents' charitable activities, or because you're trying to calculate the financial impact on your eventual inheritance?" The question was blunt and probably unfair, but David's focus on monetary details reminded me too much of his initial reaction to my cancer diagnosis. His face flushed with embarrassment and anger. "That's not why I'm asking." "Isn't it? Because every conversation we've had since my diagnosis has somehow come back to money. Costs, expenses, financial implications, inheritance protection. I'm asking because I'm trying to understand who my mother really is. Because it's becoming clear that there are major aspects of your life that I know nothing about." His answer was more thoughtful than I'd expected, and it made me reconsider my defensive response. David was right that he was learning things about his parents that challenged his fundamental understanding of our lives and values. "What would you like to know?" "I'd like to know why the staff at this hospital treats you like you're some kind of major benefactor. I'd like to know what Dr. Hendricks meant when she said you'd been instrumental in hospital improvements. I'd like to know how someone I thought was a regular volunteer has enough influence to get a private treatment room and personal attention from senior medical staff." His questions were reasonable, and his tone had shifted from defensive to genuinely curious. I realized that my continued evasiveness was probably creating more suspicion than honesty would. "Your father and I have been significant donors to this hospital for many years." "How significant?" "Significant enough that our contributions have funded major projects and programs." "Like what?" I gestured around the treatment room where we were sitting. "Like this cancer center." David looked around the room with new understanding. "You funded this?" "Your father and I were the primary donors for the cancer center renovation and expansion. We also established the Patient Assistance Fund that helps families who can't afford treatment." "The Patient Assistance Fund that Dr. Chen mentioned helps 3 families a month?" "Among other patients, yes." David sat back in his chair, processing information that reframed everything he thought he knew about his parents' relationship with the community. "How much money are we talking about, Mom?" "Does the specific amount matter?" It matters because I've been sitting here for weeks, worrying about the cost of your cancer treatment while you're receiving care in a facility you helped build with your own donations. The irony that David had finally grasped was, indeed, profound. I watched him struggle with the implications of what he'd learned, seeing his embarrassment at his own concerns mixed with amazement at his parents' generosity. The amount we've given to this hospital over the years is more than most people make in their lifetimes. How much more? I hesitated, then decided that partial honesty was worse than complete honesty. Several $1,000,000. David's mouth fell open. Several million? Over many years, through many different projects and programs. And the hospital staff know this? Some of them do. We've always insisted that our giving be as anonymous as possible, but complete anonymity isn't always practical when you're funding major capital projects. So when I was worried about your medical bills, you were actually receiving treatment in a cancer center you'd paid to build. Essentially, yes. David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture that had become increasingly frequent as he processed revelations about his family's circumstances. This is unbelievable. How could I not know about this? Because your father and I believed that charitable giving should be private and that our children should develop their own relationships with money and community service. But Mom, if I'd known about your involvement with this hospital, I never would have worried about treatment costs. I never would have suggested cheaper alternatives or discussed assisted living options. I know. You let me make a fool of myself because you wanted to see how I'd react when I thought resources were limited. I wanted to see what kind of man you'd become when caring for me might require sacrifice. The pain in David's eyes was unmistakable. He understood now that he'd failed a test he hadn't known he was taking, revealed character traits that disappointed both of us. And what kind of man did I turn out to be? It was a fair question, and one that deserved an honest answer. You turned out to be someone who calculates costs before considering needs, someone who sees family obligations as financial burdens rather than expressions of love. That's not who I want to be. I know, but David, intentions matter less than actions. And your actions over the past month have shown me that your first instinct is to protect your own financial interests rather than support family members who need help. We sat in silence for several minutes while my chemotherapy continued its slow drip into my bloodstream. The medications that were fighting my cancer had been developed through research, partly funded by grants that Harold and I had supported. The equipment monitoring my vital signs had been purchased with money we'd donated. The very building we were sitting in had been constructed with our contributions. Mom, is there more? Other things you've done that I don't know about? Your father and I supported many causes over the years. The hospital was just one of our charitable priorities. What were the others? The library expansion, scholarship funds at the local college, the food bank facility, various community service organizations. How much total giving are we talking about? I looked at my son, seeing genuine curiosity mixed with what I hoped was growing understanding of his parents' values and priorities. David, your father and I gave away more money than most people accumulate in their entire lives. And you never told us because you wanted us to develop our own work ethic and values? Partly, but also because we believed that the best charitable giving is done quietly, without seeking recognition or credit. But if people at these organizations know who you are, how is it anonymous? It's not completely anonymous, but we've never sought public recognition, never allowed our names on buildings or plaques, never used our giving for social or business advantage. David was quiet for a long time, processing information that challenged fundamental assumptions about his parents' lives and values. Finally, he spoke. I feel like I don't know you at all. You know me, David. You just didn't know about this aspect of my life. This aspect of your life involves millions of dollars and affects entire community institutions. That's not a small detail I missed. He was right. The scope of our charitable giving wasn't a minor aspect of our lives that we'd simply never mentioned. It was a fundamental expression of our values and priorities that had shaped decades of decision-making and community involvement. Your father and I made a conscious choice to keep this part of our lives private. We wanted our children to see money as a tool for helping others, not as a source of personal power or social status. Did it work? I looked at my son, thinking about his initial reaction to my cancer diagnosis and his focus on costs and financial implications. Ask me again in a few months. Carol returned to check on my treatment progress, interrupting our conversation with her professional warmth and obvious respect. How are you feeling, Mrs. Murphy? Any nausea or discomfort? I'm doing fine, thank you. Excellent. Your lab results from last week look very good, and Dr. Chen is pleased with how you're responding to treatment. After she left, David returned to his questions about our family's charitable activities. Mom, when you said you've given away more money than most people accumulate in their lifetimes, what does that actually mean in dollar terms? It means that your father was very successful financially, and we believed that success came with obligations to help others. But specifically, how much have you given away? I understood his need for concrete numbers, but I also knew that revealing the full scope of our giving would fundamentally change his understanding of our family's wealth. David, the amount we've given away is less important than the impact it's had on people's lives. For me, right now, the amount is important, because I need to understand how wrong I was about our family's financial situation. His honesty deserved a direct response. Over the course of our marriage, your father and I gave away approximately $15 million to various charitable causes. David's face went white. $15 million? Approximately. And you still have enough left that my medical bills aren't a concern? Your medical bills are completely irrelevant to our financial picture. How much do you have left? Enough that neither you nor Lisa will ever need to worry about financial security. David sat back in his chair, looking stunned by the magnitude of what he was learning. I can't believe this. My whole life, I thought we were a comfortable middle-class family. I had no idea you were wealthy enough to give away $15 million and still not worry about money. We were never wealthy for the sake of being wealthy, David. We were fortunate financially so that we could help others and ensure our family's security. But you let me worry about inheritance taxes and estate planning and college funds for the kids. You let me stress about things that apparently aren't problems at all. I let you develop your own relationship with financial responsibility. Your concerns about those things showed me that you understand the importance of planning and preparation. But they also showed you that I'm more concerned about money than about people. I looked at my son, seeing both the man who had disappointed me and the boy I'd raised with such hope. Your concerns about money aren't wrong, David, but they shouldn't be your first priority when someone you love is facing a life-threatening illness. I know that now. But Mom, how was I supposed to know that worrying about your medical bills was completely unnecessary? You weren't supposed to know that. You were supposed to offer love and support regardless of the cost. The truth of that statement hung between us, highlighting the fundamental difference between David's reaction and what I'd hoped for from my son. He'd calculated costs before offering comfort, planned for expenses before expressing love. What happens now? David asked. Between us, I mean. Now that I know about the money and the hospital donations and everything else, I apparently didn't understand about my own family. That depends on what you do with this information. What do you mean? I mean that knowing about our wealth and charitable giving doesn't automatically change who you are or how you approach relationships and responsibilities. The test isn't whether you know about the money. The test is what kind of person you choose to be regardless of financial circumstances. David nodded slowly, understanding that learning about his parents' philanthropy was just the beginning of a longer process of examining his own values and priorities. Mom, is there anything else I should know? Any other major aspects of your life that I'm completely ignorant about? I smiled at the question, thinking about the many relationships and commitments that had grown out of our charitable giving over the years. David, your father and I built relationships with people and organizations throughout this community that you know nothing about. We made commitments and took on responsibilities that extended far beyond simple financial donations. Like what? Like serving on boards and committees, like mentoring other donors, like helping organizations develop long-term strategic plans. Our charitable giving was never just about writing checks. It was about being actively involved in making positive changes in our community, and people throughout the community know about this involvement? Many do, yes. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of his parents' community connections and influence. This explains so much about how people treat you. The respect, the deference, the special attention. You're not just another patient or community member. You're someone who has had significant impact on the institutions and organizations that serve this area. Your father and I tried to have positive impact, yes. How does it feel to receive medical treatment in a facility you helped create? I considered the question carefully. It feels like the circle is completing itself. Harold and I invested in this cancer center because we believed everyone deserved access to excellent care. Now I'm benefiting from that investment in a very personal way. And how does it feel to know that your son was worried about paying for treatment in a facility his parents funded? The pain in David's voice was evident, and I felt both sympathy for his embarrassment and sadness about the character traits his worries had revealed. It feels like there's still work to do in helping you understand what really matters in life. As my chemotherapy session ended and we prepared to leave the hospital, I found myself thinking about the conversations that still needed to happen between David and me. He'd learned about our charitable giving and our relationship with the hospital, but there were deeper questions about values and priorities that would take time to address. The ride home was quiet, with David clearly processing everything he'd learned about his family's financial situation and community involvement. As we pulled into my driveway, he finally spoke. Mom, I want you to know that I'm proud of what you and Dad accomplished with your charitable giving. The impact you've had on this community is incredible. Thank you, David. That means a lot to me. But I also want you to know that I'm ashamed of how I reacted to your diagnosis. If I could go back and handle things differently, I would. I know you would. But David, we can't go back. We can only move forward and learn from what happened. How do I learn from this? How do I become the kind of person who puts love before financial calculations? It was a good question. One that suggested David was genuinely committed to examining his own character and making changes where necessary. You start by remembering that the most important things in life can't be quantified in dollar terms. Love, loyalty, integrity, compassion, none of those things show up on financial statements, but they're what determine the real value of a person's life. David nodded, but I could see that he was still struggling with the implications of what he'd learned about himself and his family. The journey from disappointment to understanding to positive change would take time, and there were no guarantees about where it would lead. That evening, as I rested and recovered from my chemotherapy session, I reflected on the day's revelations and conversations. David now knew about our charitable giving and our relationship with the hospital, but there were still aspects of our philanthropic activities that would probably surprise him. The truth was that Harold and I had been involved in far more than just donations and committee service. We'd helped other wealthy families develop their own charitable giving strategies. We'd mentored young professionals who wanted to make positive impact in their communities. We'd quietly intervened in situations where financial assistance could make the difference between success and failure for individuals and families facing crises. Our anonymity had never been complete, but it had been carefully maintained. We'd built relationships and made commitments that extended throughout the community. creating a network of trust and mutual support that David was only beginning to understand. In many ways, my cancer diagnosis was revealing as much about our family's place in the community as it was about my medical condition. The special treatment I was receiving at the hospital wasn't just about my status as a major donor. It was about the recognition that Harold and I had earned through decades of quiet service and generosity. David's education about his parents' lives was far from complete. There were still revelations to come that would challenge his understanding even further. But the foundation had been laid for conversations about values and priorities that went far deeper than money and medical bills. The question now was whether David could learn to see wealth as a tool for helping others, rather than a source of personal security and status. Whether he could develop the kind of generosity of spirit that had motivated his parents' charitable giving for decades. I was hopeful that he could make those changes, but I also knew that real transformation would require more than just learning about family history. It would require David to examine his own heart and choose to become a different kind of person than he'd revealed himself to be when he thought caring for me might cost him something. The test wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday evening in November, 3 months into my chemotherapy treatment. I had been feeling stronger each day, the cancer responding well to the aggressive protocol, when my phone rang with a number I recognized immediately. Margaret Chen from the hospital's financial office was calling, and her voice carried an urgency that made my heart race. "Mrs. Murphy, I'm so sorry to disturb you at home, but we have a situation that requires your immediate attention." "What's wrong, Margaret?" "Your son David came to the hospital this afternoon, demanding to speak with someone about your account and treatment arrangements. He's been asking very pointed questions about your donor status and seems upset about what he calls preferential treatment that he claims is inappropriate." I closed my eyes, feeling a familiar wave of disappointment wash over me. What exactly did he say? He insisted that he wanted your treatment to be transparent and fair, and that any special accommodations should be discontinued immediately. "Mrs. Murphy, he seemed to think that your donor relationship with the hospital was somehow influencing your medical care in ways that weren't ethical." The irony was staggering. David, who had spent weeks worrying about the cost of my treatment, was now demanding that I not receive the very benefits that made those costs irrelevant. He'd learned about our charitable relationship with the hospital and somehow twisted it into a problem that needed to be solved. Did he speak with anyone else? He demanded a meeting with Dr. Patricia Hendricks, and unfortunately, she was available. "Mrs. Murphy, I think you need to know what transpired in that conversation." I braced myself for whatever revelation was coming, knowing that David's capacity to disappoint me seemed to have no limits. "Dr. Hendricks explained your family's history with the hospital, thinking it would help him understand why you received certain accommodations. But instead of being grateful or proud, he became quite agitated. He accused the hospital of creating ethical conflicts by providing premium care to donors." What did Patricia say? She tried to explain that donor recognition programs are standard practice, and that your care is determined entirely by medical protocols, not your charitable status. But he wouldn't listen. "Mrs. Murphy, he actually suggested that the hospital was somehow taking advantage of your generosity." I felt something cold settle in my chest as I realized the full scope of David's misunderstanding. He'd learned about our charitable giving, and instead of appreciating its impact, he'd convinced himself that the hospital was exploiting our relationship in unethical ways. "Margaret, is there more?" "Yes, and this is the part that really concerns us. Your son asked Dr. Hendricks for detailed records of all donations your family has made to the hospital over the years. When she explained that donor information is confidential, he became quite hostile. He threatened to involve attorneys if the hospital didn't provide full transparency about what he called potential conflicts of interest in your treatment." The picture Margaret was painting was of a man who had completely lost perspective, who saw ethical problems where none existed, and conflicts of interest in arrangements that were entirely appropriate and beneficial to all parties involved. Did Patricia give him any information? She gave him general information about hospital donor recognition policies, but nothing specific about your family's giving history. However, Mrs. Murphy, he made it clear that he intends to investigate further. He mentioned hiring accountants to review your finances and attorneys to examine the hospital's donor relationships. I thanked Margaret for calling and hung up the phone with a heavy heart. My son had learned about our charitable activities, and his response was to threaten legal action against the very institutions we'd spent decades supporting. He saw impropriety where there was generosity, exploitation where there was gratitude. The next morning brought a visit from David that confirmed my worst fears about his state of mind. My son had not only imagined ethical problems where none existed, but he'd formalized his concerns through official channels that would create administrative burdens for people who had done nothing wrong. What does that mean practically? It means the hospital has to investigate his allegations, interview the medical staff involved in your care, and document that your treatment has been appropriate and based solely on medical considerations. I'm so sorry, Patricia. This is completely unnecessary and inappropriate. Jan, we know that. Everyone involved in your care knows that. But formal complaints require formal responses, regardless of their merit. What can I do to help resolve this situation? Actually, there is something. The investigation committee would like to interview you about your treatment experience and your understanding of the relationship between your donor status and your medical care. Of course, I'll do whatever is necessary to clear this up. There's one more thing, Jan. Your son has indicated that he plans to escalate his concerns beyond the hospital level. He's mentioned contacting state medical licensing boards and healthcare regulatory agencies. The scope of David's campaign against the hospital was expanding in ways that threatened to cause real damage to people and institutions that had done nothing wrong. His imaginary ethical concerns were creating actual professional and legal problems for medical staff who had provided excellent care. Patricia, is there anything I can do to stop this escalation? Honestly, I think the only thing that might stop it is if you could convince your son that his concerns are misplaced. After hanging up, I found myself facing a decision that I'd been avoiding for months. David's behavior had progressed from disappointing to destructive, and his latest campaign against the hospital threatened to damage relationships and reputations that had been built over decades of mutual trust and respect. The time had come to reveal the full truth about our family's relationship with St. Mary's Medical Center, not just the charitable giving that David already knew about, but the deeper connections that would help him understand how completely wrong his assumptions were about conflicts of interest and ethical compromises. The next morning, I called David and asked him to come to the house for a conversation that would, I hoped, end his misguided crusade against the hospital. David, we need to talk about your concerns regarding my treatment at St. Mary's. Good. I'm glad you're finally taking this seriously. I am taking it seriously, but probably not in the way you expect. David settled into his chair with the satisfied expression of someone who believed he'd finally convinced a stubborn parent to see reason. I looked at this man who had somehow convinced himself that his parents' generosity created ethical problems rather than community benefits. David, you're concerned about conflicts of interest in my medical care because of our family's donor relationship with the hospital. Exactly. And you believe that the hospital staff might be compromising medical judgment to maintain good relationships with major donors. That's the concern, yes. What would you say if I told you that your concerns are based on a fundamental misunderstanding of our family's relationship with St. Mary's? What kind of misunderstanding? I took a deep breath, preparing to share information that would either shock David into understanding or provide him with new ammunition for his destructive campaign. David, your father and I weren't just donors to St. Mary's Medical Center. We were founding partners in its development and ongoing operations. What does that mean? It means that when the hospital was planning its expansion 20 years ago, Harold and I didn't just donate money for construction. We participated in every aspect of planning, design, staffing, and operational development. David's expression showed confusion mixed with growing concern. Participated how? Harold served on the hospital's board of directors for 15 years. I've been on the board for 12 years and currently serve as vice chair. We weren't just donors. We were governance partners who helped shape every major decision the hospital has made for the past 2 decades. You're on the hospital board? I'm vice chair of the board of directors, chair of the strategic planning committee, and co-chair of the capital campaign that funded the cancer center where I'm receiving treatment. David stared at me as if I'd suddenly revealed that I was someone he'd never met before. You're telling me that you're not just a patient at St. Mary's. You're one of the people who runs it? I'm telling you that your concerns about conflicts of interest are meaningless because my relationship with the hospital goes far deeper than any donor-patient dynamic you've imagined. But that makes the conflicts of interest even worse. David's response revealed how completely he'd missed the point of my revelation. Instead of understanding that board governance relationships made his concerns about donor conflicts irrelevant, he decided that they made those concerns more serious. How does my board service make conflicts of interest worse? Because now you're not just a donor receiving preferential treatment, you're a board member receiving care from an institution you help govern. That's a massive conflict of interest. I realized that David was so committed to finding ethical problems that he couldn't recognize when his original concerns had been rendered meaningless by new information. David, do you understand what hospital board governance involves? Not specifically, but I know board members have fiduciary responsibilities and oversight authority. Board members hire senior administrators, approve major expenditures, set strategic priorities, and ensure that the hospital operates according to its mission and values. Exactly. And you don't see how receiving medical treatment from an institution you help govern creates ethical conflicts? I see how someone who doesn't understand healthcare governance might think it creates conflicts. What do you mean? I mean that hospital board members and their families have always received care from the institutions they govern. It's not a conflict of interest. It's a natural consequence of community leadership and institutional loyalty. David looked frustrated by my response, as if I were being deliberately obtuse about obvious ethical problems. Mom, just because something is common practice doesn't mean it's ethical. You're right. But in this case, it's both common practice and completely ethical. How can you be sure? Because hospital governance includes specific policies and procedures for managing situations where board members or their families need medical care. Because my medical treatment is overseen by professional staff who report to administrators I didn't hire and can't fire. Because my care is determined by medical protocols that were established by medical professionals, not by board governance decisions. But don't you have influence over hospital policies and personnel decisions? Board-level influence over institutional policies and strategic direction, yes, but no influence over individual treatment decisions or day-to-day medical operations. How can you be sure that your board position doesn't affect how medical staff treat you? Because I understand the difference between institutional governance and clinical operations. Because I trust the professional integrity of my medical team, and because the treatment is working. David seemed genuinely puzzled by my confidence, that my board service didn't create ethical problems in my medical care. Mom, I still think you should get second opinions from hospitals where you don't have governance relationships. Why? To ensure that your treatment decisions aren't influenced by institutional loyalties or personal relationships. David, do you think I would continue receiving treatment that wasn't medically appropriate because of institutional loyalty? I think personal relationships and institutional commitments can influence judgment in ways people don't always recognize. And you think getting care from strangers would somehow result in better medical decision-making? I think it would. Remove potential sources of bias and conflict. I looked at my son, seeing someone who had become so obsessed with theoretical ethical concerns that he'd lost sight of practical medical realities. David, let me tell you something about the cancer center where I'm receiving treatment. What about it? Your father and I didn't just fund its construction. We participated in every aspect of its planning and design. We helped recruit the medical staff, select the equipment, develop the treatment protocols, and establish the patient care standards. What are you saying? I'm saying that the excellent care I'm receiving isn't happening despite my relationship with the hospital. It's happening because of my relationship with the hospital. Because Harold and I spent years working to create exactly the kind of cancer treatment facility that would provide the best possible care for patients like me. David's expression showed dawning comprehension of what I was telling him. You helped design the cancer center? Harold and I were intimately involved in every aspect of its development. The patient rooms, the treatment protocols, the staffing patterns, the equipment selection, the support services, we helped plan all of it. So when you receive care there, I'm receiving care in a facility that was designed according to my own vision of what excellent cancer treatment should look like. And the medical staff? We're recruited according to criteria that Harold and I helped establish, using standards that we helped develop. And the treatment protocols were selected and implemented through processes that we helped design and oversee. David sat back in his chair, finally beginning to understand that his concerns about conflicts of interest were based on a complete misunderstanding of our family's relationship with the hospital. Mom, why didn't you tell me about your board service when I started raising concerns about donor conflicts? Because I wanted to see how you'd handle the situation based on the information you had. You tested me again. I observed your character under pressure again. And what did you observe? I looked at my son, seeing someone who had consistently chosen to find problems rather than appreciate solutions, to imagine conflicts rather than recognize benefits, to create complications rather than trust relationships. I observed someone who is so focused on finding ethical problems that he can't recognize ethical solutions, someone who would rather disrupt successful relationships than trust the integrity of the people involved. I was trying to protect you. From what? From receiving excellent medical care in a facility I helped create, from a medical team I helped recruit, using protocols I helped establish, from potential conflicts of interest that could compromise your care. David, the only thing that has threatened to compromise my care is your campaign against the hospital that's treating me. I was trying to ensure ethical treatment. By filing formal complaints against medical professionals who have provided excellent care, by threatening to involve regulatory agencies in situations where no problems exist. David's face showed embarrassment as he began to understand the damage his misguided crusade had caused. I thought I was doing the right thing. You thought you were solving problems that existed only in your imagination. What happens now? Now you apologize to the hospital staff for wasting their time and creating unnecessary complications. Now you withdraw your formal complaints and cancel any plans to involve external regulatory agencies. And then you examine your character and ask yourself why your first instinct is always to find problems rather than appreciate solutions. David nodded slowly, understanding that his latest campaign against the hospital was just another example of the character flaws that had been revealed throughout my illness. Mom, I want you to know that I never intended to cause problems for you or the hospital. I know that, David, but intentions matter less than outcomes, and the outcome of your concerns about ethical conflicts has been to create actual problems. for people who were doing nothing wrong. How do I make this right? You start by understanding that your parents didn't just give money to community institutions. We helped build them, lead them, and ensure their success. Your concerns about conflicts of interest aren't just misplaced. They're an attack on decades of community service and institutional leadership. I didn't understand the full scope of your involvement. Because you didn't ask. Because you assumed you understood situations that you knew nothing about. Because you looked for problems instead of seeking understanding. David was quiet for several minutes, processing the full implications of what he'd learned about our family's relationship with the hospital and his own misguided response to that relationship. Mom, is there anything else about your community involvement that I don't understand? David, your father and I have been leaders in this community for decades. We've served on boards, chaired committees, founded organizations, and supported institutions throughout this area. The hospital is just one example of our involvement. What are the others? The library, the college, the community foundation, the art center, the youth programs, the senior services, the environmental initiatives. There isn't a major community institution or program that hasn't benefited from our leadership and support. David's expression showed amazement mixed with something that looked like shame. I had no idea. Because you never asked. Because you assumed your parents were ordinary people with ordinary involvement in ordinary activities. But why didn't you ever tell us about all this? Because Harold and I believed that true community service is done quietly, without seeking recognition or credit. Because we wanted our children to develop their own relationships with community service, rather than trading on their parents' reputations. Did it work? I looked at my son, thinking about his reaction to my illness, his concerns about costs and conflicts, his inability to see past financial considerations to human relationships and community obligations. Ask me again in a few years. David left that afternoon with a better understanding of his parents' place in the community, but with little apparent insight into his own character flaws. He apologized for his misguided campaign against the hospital and promised to withdraw his complaints, but I could see that he still didn't fully understand why his approach to the situation had been so wrong. Over the following weeks, David did make appropriate apologies to hospital staff and formally withdrew his complaints about conflicts of interest. But his interactions with me remained awkward and strained, as if he wasn't sure how to relate to a mother who had turned out to be someone quite different from who he'd thought she was. The chemotherapy continued with excellent results, and by Christmas, Dr. Martinez was able to report that my cancer was in complete remission. The treatment, that David had initially worried was too expensive, then feared was ethically compromised, had been entirely successful. At the Christmas dinner table, surrounded by family members who had gathered to celebrate my recovery, I found myself reflecting on the lessons of the past year. David had learned about our family's wealth and community involvement, but I wasn't sure he'd learned anything meaningful about character, integrity, or the values that truly matter in life. Lisa raised a toast to my health and recovery, and everyone joined in with genuine warmth and celebration. But when David spoke, his words revealed that he still didn't fully understand what the past year had taught us about family, love, and priorities. Mom, I'm grateful that you had access to the best possible medical care and that everything worked out so well. I'm also grateful that our family has the resources to handle medical crises without financial stress. His toast was focused on outcomes and resources rather than on relationships and values. He was grateful for my recovery, but his gratitude was expressed in terms of medical access and financial capacity rather than love, support, and family bonds. After dinner, as family members prepared to leave, David approached me privately with what seemed like genuine curiosity about the future. Mom, now that your treatment is finished and you're healthy again, what are your plans for the hospital board and your other community commitments? I plan to continue serving as long as I'm able to make meaningful contributions. Even though you're in your 70s and have been through a serious illness? especially because I'm in my 70s and have been through a serious illness. Experience and perspective matter in community leadership. But don't you think it might be time to step back and let younger people take on those responsibilities? I looked at my son, wondering if his question reflected genuine concern about my health or continued discomfort with my community leadership roles. David, are you suggesting I should resign from my board positions? I'm suggesting you should. Consider whether continued involvement is worth the stress and time commitment. And what would you suggest I do with the time and energy I'd save by resigning from community service? Enjoy your retirement, travel, spend time with family. And you don't think continued community service is a worthwhile way to spend my remaining years? I think you've already done more than your share of community service. When is someone's share of community service complete, David? When they've contributed enough that they can retire with a clear conscience. I realized that David still didn't understand that community service isn't a debt to be paid off, but a continuous obligation that comes with privilege and resources. He saw my board service as something I'd done long enough to check off a list rather than as an ongoing expression of values and priorities. David, do you think Harold and I served on boards and supported community organizations because we felt obligated to do a certain amount of service? He arrived at my house carrying a briefcase and wearing the grim expression of someone preparing for battle. Mom, we need to talk about your relationship with St. Mary's Hospital. I thought we already had that conversation. We talked about your charitable giving, but we didn't talk about the ethical implications of receiving medical treatment from an institution you've donated money to. I stared at my son, trying to understand how he'd reached the conclusion that there was something unethical about receiving excellent medical care from a hospital that appreciated our family's generosity. What ethical implications are you concerned about, David? Don't you see the conflict of interest? You're receiving preferential treatment because you're a major donor. That's not fair to other patients, and it potentially compromises the quality of your medical care. How does receiving excellent care compromise the quality of that care? Because the medical staff might be more focused on keeping a major donor happy than on providing objective medical treatment. I looked at my son with growing amazement at his ability to find problems where none existed. David, are you suggesting that Dr. Martinez and the oncology team are providing inappropriate treatment because of our charitable relationship with the hospital? I'm suggesting that their judgment might be influenced by non-medical factors, such as the pressure to maintain good relationships with major donors, the desire to avoid any criticism that might affect future giving, the possibility that they're providing more aggressive or expensive treatment than necessary because they know cost isn't a factor for our family. The twisted logic of David's concerns was breathtaking. He'd started by worrying that my treatment was too expensive, then learned that cost wasn't an issue, and now he was worried that lack of cost constraints might lead to excessive treatment. David, do you trust Dr. Martinez's medical judgment? Of course I do, but I'm concerned about external pressures that might influence her recommendations. What external pressures? The pressure to maintain good relationships with the hospital's major donors. And you think she would compromise my medical care to maintain those relationships? I think she might unconsciously bias her treatment, recommendations in ways that favor donor interests over patient interests. I realized that David had constructed an elaborate fantasy in which the hospital's appreciation for our charitable giving created ethical conflicts that threatened the integrity of my medical care. He'd taken a straightforward situation and invented problems that existed only in his imagination. David, what would you have me do about these concerns? I want you to transfer your care to a different hospital where you don't have donor relationships. The suggestion was so absurd that I almost laughed. You want me to leave an excellent medical team in the middle of successful cancer treatment because you've imagined ethical conflicts that don't exist? I want you to receive medical care that's based solely on medical considerations, not influenced by financial relationships. And you think I'm not receiving that kind of care at St. Mary's? I think the potential for conflicts of interest is too great to ignore. I looked at my son, seeing someone who had become so focused on finding problems that he'd lost sight of actual reality. His latest concern about ethical conflicts was just another manifestation of his obsession with financial considerations at the expense of human relationships and practical outcomes. David, let me ask you something. If I weren't receiving excellent care at St. Mary's, if the treatment weren't working, if I weren't responding well to the protocols, would your concerns about donor relationships matter? Of course not. Your health is the most important thing. And since I am receiving excellent care, since the treatment is working, since I am responding well, why do theoretical concerns about ethical conflicts matter more than practical outcomes? Because ethics matter even when outcomes are good. But whose ethics are we talking about? Yours, mine, the hospital's, or the medical profession's? Medical ethics. The principle that treatment decisions should be based solely on medical considerations. And do you have any evidence that my treatment decisions haven't been based solely on medical considerations? David hesitated, apparently not having considered that his concerns needed to be supported by actual evidence rather than theoretical possibilities. I don't have direct evidence, but the potential for conflicts is clear. Potential conflicts that exist only in your imagination? Potential conflicts that exist whenever patients have financial relationships with healthcare providers. I realized that David had latched onto abstract ethical principles without understanding their practical application or considering whether they actually applied to our situation. David, do you know what would constitute an actual ethical conflict in my medical care? Receiving different treatment because of donor status. I am receiving different accommodations because of donor status. A private room, personal attention from staff, direct access to senior administrators. But my medical treatment, the medications, the protocols, the monitoring, the surgical procedures, all of that is determined entirely by medical considerations. But how can you be sure? Because I trust my medical team, because the treatment is working, and because I understand the difference between enhanced amenities and compromised care. David's response revealed the depth of his misunderstanding about the situation. He'd confused donor recognition with medical corruption, customer service with ethical compromise. Mom, I've scheduled consultations with oncologists at 3 other hospitals. I think you should get second opinions about your treatment plan. Why? To ensure that you're receiving appropriate care that isn't influenced by your donor relationships. David, second opinions are valuable when there are questions about diagnosis or treatment effectiveness. Are you questioning Dr. Martinez's diagnosis? No. Are you questioning the effectiveness of my treatment? No, but then why do you think second opinions are necessary? Because I want to ensure that your treatment plan is based solely on medical considerations. And you think getting opinions from doctors who don't know about our charitable giving will somehow validate or invalidate the treatment I'm already receiving? It will provide objective perspective from medical professionals who don't have financial relationships with our family. I found myself wondering how David had developed such a suspicious view of human nature that he assumed financial relationships automatically corrupted professional judgment. David, do you think every patient who has ever made a charitable donation to a hospital is receiving compromised medical care? I think the potential for conflicts of interest should be avoided whenever possible. Even when avoiding those conflicts means disrupting successful treatment relationships, if necessary, yes. And you think theoretical ethical purity is more important than practical medical outcomes? I think ethical considerations should be part of medical decision-making. I looked at my son, seeing someone who had become so obsessed with abstract principles that he'd lost sight of concrete realities. His concern about ethical conflicts was just another example of his tendency to create problems where none existed. David, I'm not changing hospitals. I'm not seeking second opinions based on imaginary ethical concerns. I'm continuing my treatment with a medical team that has provided excellent care and achieved excellent results. But Mom, no, David, this conversation is over. That evening, I received another call from Patricia Hendricks at the hospital. Her voice carried a mixture of concern and frustration that made it clear David's visit had created problems beyond what Margaret Chen had described. Jan, I hope you don't mind my calling, but your son's visit yesterday has created some complications that I think you should know about. What kind of complications? After our conversation, he went to the medical staff office and filed a formal complaint about potential conflicts of interest in your treatment. He's alleging that your donor status has compromised the objectivity of your medical care. I closed my eyes, feeling a wave of embarrassment wash over me. Didn't you? We served because we believed that those with resources and abilities have ongoing responsibilities to help build and maintain strong communities. But at some point, don't those responsibilities shift to the next generation? They expand to include the next generation. They don't transfer away from people who still have resources and abilities to contribute. But Mom, you're 73 years old. Don't you deserve to enjoy your retirement without the stress of board meetings and committee responsibilities? I looked at my son, seeing someone who still thought of community service as a burden to be endured rather than a privilege to be embraced. David, do you think I serve on the hospital board because I feel obligated to do so? Don't you? I serve because I enjoy it, because I'm good at it, and because the work matters. The hospital is stronger because of my involvement, and I'm more fulfilled because of my service. But don't you want to slow down and take it easy? I want to continue contributing to my community for as long as I'm able to make meaningful contributions. David seemed genuinely puzzled by my commitment to continued community service, as if he couldn't understand why someone would choose to remain involved in demanding volunteer work when they could afford to retire and relax. What about spending more time with family? What about it? Don't you want to be more available for your children and grandchildren? I'm available when you need me, David, but I'm not going to structure my life around waiting for family members to decide they want my attention. That's not what I meant. What did you mean? I meant that family should be your top priority now that you're retired and healthy. I looked at my son, realizing that he still didn't understand that family love and community service weren't competing priorities, but complementary expressions of the same values. David, my family is important to me, but so is my community. I don't have to choose between them. But if you had to choose, I wouldn't have to choose. People who love their families and serve their communities don't face that kind of either-or decision. But what if family members needed more of your time and attention? Then I'd provide it. But David, needing more time and wanting more time are different things. What do you mean? I mean that if you or Lisa or the grandchildren genuinely needed my time and attention, I'd be there. But if you simply want me to be more available for casual socializing or routine activities, that's not the same as genuine need. David seemed uncomfortable with my distinction between genuine family needs and routine family expectations. Don't you think grandparents should be available to help with childcare and family activities? When genuinely needed, yes. But, David, I'm not going to resign from meaningful community work to become a full-time babysitter or social coordinator. That's not what I'm suggesting. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that at this stage of your life, family should be your primary focus. And community service should be what exactly? A secondary priority that you pursue when family responsibilities allow. I realized that David wanted me to reorganize my priorities in ways that would make his family's needs and preferences the center of my life rather than one important part of a life that included multiple meaningful commitments. David, do you think that would make me happier or more fulfilled? I think it would make you more available to the people who love you most. The people who love me most want me to be happy and fulfilled. They don't want me to sacrifice meaningful work to become more available for their convenience. But don't you want to enjoy your golden years? I am enjoying them by continuing to do work that matters with people I respect in service of causes I believe in. David seemed frustrated by my resistance to his vision of how I should spend my remaining years. His suggestions about stepping back from community service and focusing on family reflected his inability to understand that meaningful work and loving relationships weren't competing priorities but mutually reinforcing aspects of a well-lived life. 6 months later, as I prepared for the annual hospital fundraising gala, I reflected on the journey that had begun with my cancer diagnosis and led to so many revelations about family, character, and values. David had learned about our wealth and community involvement, but I wasn't sure he'd learned anything meaningful about the character traits that really matter in life. At the gala, as I was honored for my decades of service to the hospital, David sat at our family table looking uncomfortable with the recognition his mother was receiving. When the hospital announced the establishment of the Harold and Janice Murphy Center for Excellence in Cancer Care, named in recognition of our lifetime of support, David's expression showed embarrassment rather than pride. After the ceremony, as family and friends gathered to congratulate me, David approached with what seemed like genuine confusion about the evening's events. "Mom, I had no idea that you and Dad were so well known and respected in the community. Now you know. But why didn't you ever tell us about recognition like this?" "Because the recognition isn't the point, David. The work is the point." "But don't you feel proud of having a cancer center named after you and Dad?" "I feel grateful that we were able to contribute to something that will help people for generations to come." "And you don't feel any satisfaction in being recognized for your contributions?" "I feel satisfaction in knowing that the contributions made a difference." David seemed puzzled by my response, as if he couldn't understand why someone wouldn't be primarily motivated by public recognition and social status. "Mom, all this community recognition, all these relationships with important people, all this influence and respect, doesn't that make you feel successful?" I looked at my son, seeing someone who still measured success in terms of external recognition rather than internal satisfaction, public status rather than personal integrity. David, do you know what makes me feel successful?" "What?" "Knowing that I spent my life trying to help others. Knowing that Harold and I used our good fortune to make our community stronger. Knowing that we raised children who understand the difference between right and wrong." "And do you think you succeeded in that last goal?" I looked at David, thinking about his reaction to my illness, his concerns about costs and conflicts, his inability to see past financial considerations to human relationships and moral obligations. Ask me again in a few years. As the evening ended and family members prepared to go home, I found myself thinking about the lessons of the past year and wondering whether David would ever develop the kind of character that Harold and I had tried to instill in our children. He'd learned about our wealth and community involvement, but he'd responded to those revelations by trying to optimize our charitable giving for family financial advantage and questioning the ethics of our community relationships. His fundamental approach to life remained transactional rather than relational, focused on personal benefit rather than community service. The test that had begun with my cancer diagnosis was essentially complete. David had revealed himself to be someone who calculated costs before expressing love, who saw ethical problems where none existed, who prioritized family financial advantage over community obligation. But tests can be retaken, and character can be developed at any age. The question wasn't whether David had failed to meet my expectations over the past year. The question was whether he was capable of learning from his failures and becoming a different kind of person in the years ahead. As I prepared for bed that night, I found myself hopeful that David might still develop the kind of character that would make his father and me proud. But I was also realistic about the challenges he faced in overcoming patterns of thinking and behavior that had been revealed so clearly during my illness. The cancer was gone, my health was restored, and our family's financial security was assured. But the deeper questions about character, values, and what really matters in life remained as relevant as ever. David now knew the truth about his parents' wealth and community involvement. The question was what he would do with that knowledge, and whether he would use it to become a better person or simply a more sophisticated calculator of personal advantage. Time would tell. But at 73, having survived cancer and learned painful truths about my son's character, I had neither the energy nor the inclination to spend my remaining years trying to fix what David had become. I would continue, loving him as my son while accepting him as the man he'd chosen to be. Some lessons can only be learned through lived experience, and some character flaws can only be overcome through personal choice and sustained effort that must come from within. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.